to I wanted to talk about um, what it means to live a Dharma life today, because what are our models? One of my friends, Musang, who's at the so is everybody else blackout so I don't see everybody? Is that my
I think
computer?
they're all just,
Oh, okay.
checking their email or something.
Okay. So one of my friends, who's back at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, uh, said at one point the most important decision the Buddha made was to remain a monk. And that's been a koan for me for a number of years. What does that mean about his teaching, about his lifestyle, about our lifestyle, how we're living and what we're doing? Um, because the Dharma life 2,500 years ago in the forest with the Buddha is not something that's likely to happen these days. And so the question is, what does a Dharma life look like? The Dalai Lama's life does not look like a forest monk. And those are sort of the models that we have. The Sangha, the monastic order, still retains um, those principles of living, which were established then, and give that keeps that model in our mind. But we have a whole bunch of different people. We've got the Dalai Lama. We've got any of you familiar with Panyavati? She showed up in Sacramento a while ago. She started as a Baptist nun, and then had some experiences that her seniors told her she didn't have, and so she went off and became a Taoist nun. And then the guy said, "Well, there's too much compassion in your teaching. You have to go and become a Buddhist nun." So she ordained, and she is in Asheville, North Carolina. She's black, and when she gives a Dharma talk, it's like a Baptist revival meeting. I mean, it's with irreverence and flourishes. But I met her and she's in robes. I met her in Massachusetts, and because I had to pick her up at the airport, I thought, well, she's a nun. I need to have another woman in the car with me. Of course, she didn't care, it turned out. The only thing she had me do on the way back was to stop at a 7-Eleven so that she could buy a bag full of candy, because there was not going to be any candy at the retreat center. And and so she would give these Dharma talks in the morning and then take lunch off. And at lunch, she was doing business. So she had been a banker before she became a nun. And so what she was doing at lunch, she was going off and buying credit card debt. So she would go to somebody owes $10,000 on their credit card debt, or 20,000, and they're going to go bankrupt. They can't pay it. The bank will sell that debt for a couple $100. So she would buy that, and then she would call the debtors and say, for $400, you're out of debt. The $20,000 is erased. You don't have to declare bankruptcy. It's win-win. And she used those profits to support a shelter for homeless children in Asheville, North Carolina. Is that a Dharma life? Bernie Glassman, who was a street minister. Lee Brasington teaches Dharma retreats. What does a Dharma life look like? The Buddha's decision to remain a monk meant that he outsourced a large portion of his livelihood. He didn't have to make a living. He didn't have to create a living, but a living had to be made for him. And he outsourced it. And in exchange for the alms that he received, he provided teaching. So it was a transactional relationship. He didn't do charities. Bhikkhu Bodhi, as traditional a monk as you can imagine, has founded Buddhist Global Relief in the wake of the tsunami. You know, is this a Dharma life, or should he be sitting on Vulture Peak and, you know, meditating all day? Um, what does it mean? How do you live the Dharma life today? Do you build sanghas? Do you become a hermit? You know, a lot of this centers attention on the element of right livelihood that's in the Eightfold Path. That's very rarely talked about. I mean, how many talks have you heard about right livelihood? And then it's usually about, do you have to lie to your clients or something like that. Um, the Buddha said, this is all that the Buddha said about livelihood for lay people. O monks, these 5 trades should not be taken up by lay followers: trading in weapons, trading in living beings, trading in meat, trading in intoxicants, and trading in poisons. That's the extent of his instruction. A lot of instruction for monks and nuns, all 227 precepts for monks and 250 something. So he was busy, but this was you know, um, what if you were a manager of a Safeway? So you sort of got things in there that could be weapons. You certainly got meat, and you got intoxicants, even poisons. And if you got a lobster pound, or you're selling oysters, you're dealing in living beings. So I don't have answers for these questions. So I'm just going to pose a bunch of questions about what it means, and, you know, for purposes of investigation. How do we live today? What does right livelihood mean? At the time of the Buddha, it was very simple. You had your livelihood determined all of your lifestyle. But today, the production of our livelihood is different from the lifestyle we create. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because right livelihood is not just right job. You know? And the kind of, you know, how we provide for our livelihood will depend on the kind of livelihood we decide to provide. You know, do we get the high price spread? Do we get the economy spread? Do we give up spread entirely? You know, the more demand we create for the way we live, of course, then the more income. Isn't it interesting? We don't produce our livelihood directly. We don't produce food and then trade it for a pair of shoes. We earn a salary. We earn income. And that's an abstract thing. So the way we provide income, you know, what if you are working for Halliburton as a file clerk? Is that okay? If you live in Harlan County, Kentucky, is it okay if you're working for a coal mine? Or if you're in Morenci, Arizona, you're working for a copper mine that uses more power than the city of Tucson? You know, how do you decide what right job is? Right job, the interconnectivity of our life now is so intense that it's very difficult to separate ourselves from almost anything. Is it okay to work for Facebook? You know, how do we finance our livelihood? It's a financial matter now. It's not just a direct. I mean, if you look around, how much of what is in your possession, in your control, did you actually make from scratch? Not much of anything. You know, maybe if you're making art or something, and you've got some weird things sitting around your house or paintings or something. So the purpose of sustaining our life, you know, what are we actually doing with this process of financing? You know, I remember being on a retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, 30 years ago, and it was it was 400 people on this retreat. And in the dining hall, we said a grace before each meal. And the only thing I recall about the grace was that the line was, we accept this food for the realization of the way. So the food is for the purpose of the Dharma. Is that why we eat and feed ourselves? Or are we trying to, survive better, more comfortably, get along easier, make a name for ourselves? There are all kinds of things that can be involved in the process of financing our livelihood. I think it's, in some ways, it's less important what we do than the constellation of intentions that we bring to our task. What are the requisites? The Buddha had four requisites for monks and nuns. I guess they're still the same four requisites: food, clothing, shelter, and medicine. Food. Monastics don't make choices about what they eat. They eat what's given to them. Clothing. You can wear anything you want as long as it's orange. And you get two of them. Shelter. What are we talking about? A hut? Someplace in Beverly Hills? And then medicine, I mean, does that include medical insurance? What the requisites now don't overlay directly over our life. The question is, what kind of a life we will build? What are requisites for us? Do we need a credit card? If you say we don't need a credit card, what are you doing with a credit card? So we actually, at least our understanding is, we got to have a credit card. What about specialized skills? What about the education that it takes to get specialized skills? Are these requisites? Would it be unfair to a child growing up today to just say, you don't need all these things, all these trappings of content? Even people raising their kids off the grid and homeschooling probably teach them skills like reading. Do you need to know how to read? Is that a requisite? Maybe not at the Buddha's time, but requisites are not obvious right now. People will say, I need this, when really they want this. How do you distinguish between a need and a want? It's actually an important issue, because we outsource a lot of our livelihood too. We outsource our safety. George Orwell, a quote from George Orwell that I like, and I don't know where it's from. It's been in my notes for years, so I assume I actually took it from somewhere, so I attribute to him. But the truth of it is still there. He says, "We sleep soundly in our beds at night, because harsh men stand ready to visit violence on those who would harm us." So we're not separate from the police and the military. Our lifestyle, which is stable and secure relatively, is protected. Is this a life that we need? Do we need access to the news? Is, are those kinds of things important? So building our life, in the Metta Sutta, the phrase is unburdened with duties and frugal in their ways. So if you are frugal in your ways, you might be less burdened with duties. Maybe not. It's situational. So there's, the overall question is, how are we going to live our lives today? How are we going to go forward? And there's two issues here that show up in Buddhism and in religion generally. The question is, how do we understand the meaning of this life we're in the middle of right now? Do we see it as a means to an end? Is it essentially a means to an end? For Buddhists, this would mean um, it, the precious human birth is the ideal incarnation from which to find liberation from the rounds of samsara. I went to a bookstore on Van Ness Avenue in San Francisco. It's a Chinese Buddhist bookstore, and I bought a bell. And the woman behind the cash register asked me if I knew how to use it. I didn't know what she was getting at, but I said, yeah. And she said, good, because if you use it correctly, we'll have a better incarnation next time. So if your orientation to this life is it's instrumental, it's very different than if you think this life is the life and its value is intrinsic to it, not instrumental to something else. So how do we live here? If it's instrumental, then we have to figure out how to use it. But if the value is here, as I think the Buddha understood it to be, the purpose was to not to understand suffering and free ourselves from suffering, to not make things worse. A lot of people, if you've been on retreat, you know that one of the questions that always gets asked at the end of the retreats, after people have gotten very calm and peaceful and are feeling really good, somebody always says, how do I bring this into my daily life? And usually the answer is something like, well, meditate more and, hook up with the Sangha and stuff like that. There's an orientation towards somehow bringing the Dharma into our life. I think maybe it's a little different. I think it's a matter of adjusting our life to accord with the Dharma, to make changes to the way we live in accord with the Dharma. The way we do that is to study suffering and the end of suffering, to study the way in which the ways in which we make things worse for ourselves. I mean, I don't think we're stupid, we're slow. We don't notice how we're hurting ourselves, how we're adding more unpleasantness and pain to ourselves. As soon as we see, we stop. We're not stupid, we're just slow. So the idea is, as part of the process of crafting a lifestyle, we want to bring mindful attention to the suffering that is in our life. And I think I've talked about this before, and that is, I think the best marker for complaint that I know, for dukkha, for suffering, is complaint. Because complaint is a direct expression of dissatisfaction. So we want to bring mindful attention to our complaints. What kind of delusion was I under when I thought things were supposed to play out the way I thought they should? What what was, try to articulate that delusion, find it in yourself, just what it is. What was I thinking? When things, surprise is a great measure of um, expectations that were not founded in reality. Anybody surprised that Donald Trump won the last time? Well, that just shows what we knew. Anytime you get surprised, your expectations were not in accord with the way things are. Anytime you're complaining, you're expressing dissatisfaction. The unpleasantness is already there. We bring our dissatisfaction to it and we add the unpleasantness of our own dissatisfaction to whatever it is that is unpleasant. So I think as soon as we see that, we change the way we act, because why would you, it's like, that old joke about the guy who goes to the doctor and he says, "Doc, it hurts when I do this." And the doc says, "Stop doing that." I know. My dad told me that joke. So the idea is to start to pay attention to the times when we make things worse. We can look for opportunities to provide assistance to ourselves and others, to respond with compassion. Because when we find pain and unpleasantness, particularly pain and unpleasantness that we're adding ourselves, the Buddha said there are two kinds of compassionate response, two ways to provide assistance. And the first is the worldly way. That's the way if someone's hungry, you give them food. If they're cold, you give them a blanket. If they're lonely, you bring your body and you're present with them. And the second way is help with the Dharma. And that's probably not, he didn't have a Dharma talk in mind. Help with the Dharma isn't giving somebody a Dharma talk. When people are having trouble, they don't want to hear. But sometimes you can point in ways, the story of Kisagatami, who came to the Buddha in grieving terribly because she'd lost her child. I believe she actually was not able to put the baby's body down. And the Buddha said, I can fix you. Just go into the village and bring me a handful of mustard seeds. Gather one from each house where they've never had a death. And the women went into town and, of course, found that there was no place. It's a lesson in the Dharma. So lessons in the Dharma can be different. It could be a joke. It could be some way of recognizing, and it may not be possible for us to do it in every situation. Just to recognize the impermanence, the delusional expectations that make us unhappy. And we want to cultivate our awareness of suffering and our compassionate response to suffering. So we can look for opportunities. One of the things, I'm just going to add this, and something that practice that my wife has taken on. Of course, we're all locked down now and sheltering in place, so we don't leave our apartment pretty much. But we live in a retirement community, and when we would go to dinner, my wife set as her goal as we walked out the door to look for opportunities to be kind to people that we would meet in the hall or in line at the waiting to get into the dining hall, or so you can set practice rules. We can cultivate those kinds of things in ourselves and let our life change in accord with the insights that we are able to harvest from our meditation practice and our attention to suffering. I think the right livelihood, right lifestyle, we need to look for models that aren't just the monastic model, because as lay people, I think it's possible to cultivate equanimity, which is really what the goal of the practice is, in my understanding. To cultivate equanimity, we can do that in our lives. If we didn't mind when things were unpleasant. Somebody once asked Krishnamurti what was the secret to his demeanor, and he said, "I don't mind what happens." So you don't fight against what happens. When it's unpleasant and painful, you can address it by trying to relieve the unpleasantness, either through worldly material means or through some kind of Dharma insight that gets expressed in an appropriate behavior. What is that? You know, the first Zen patriarch was asked what the essence of Zen was, and his answer was an appropriate response. And that appropriate response is not rule-based. It's not a bright line. It's appropriate. It depends on the context. So the context of our lives is different than the context of the Buddha's. Our understanding of the world we live in is different than the understanding of the world he had. But the qualities of our heart and mind are the same. So let me just pause there, because we're on a 30-30-30 kind of thing. I can't see all these people here who are just, they're just names to me.